Hey everyone, this time we are going to be covering Itchy Tasty, An Unofficial History of Resident Evil by Alex Aniel. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly, Alex. I'm kind of guessing on some of these every once in a while. This book covers the history of Resident Evil from its origins on the Famicom with Sweet Home up until the fourth Resident Evil game. So we really cover kind of like the main group of people that are working on Resident Evil. It's kind of a cool history to go over. They do go into some of the spin-offs as well, but we're really following the main team here. Talking a little bit about Sweet Home really quick, I didn't know that was a licensed game. It was kind of cool to read about that and to read how sort of the origins of Resident Evil started off with a movie, because that's kind of how a lot of these feel to me. They feel like sort of kind of one of the higher budget zombie movies, if that makes any sense. Another thing Alex brings up, aside from Sweet Home and its origins, he talks a bit about the state of Capcom at the time that Resident Evil was made. So throughout the sort of late 80s and early 90s, Capcom had a lot of success with Mega Man and Street Fighter. They made other games at the same time, but really those two were kind of like the staples of Capcom at that particular time period. They really milked those two franchises. The first game in Mega Man and the first Street Fighter, those didn't do as well, but the second game in each series really took off. And from there, Capcom kind of stagnated as they kept putting out basically the same game, but with like a fresh coat of paint on it. It's not to say either one of those series were bad, it's just they kept doing the same thing, and it kind of got a little old, to be perfectly honest. So in the mid-90s, they got the idea, hey, let's try to go back to Sweet Home and make another horror game. They didn't have a license to make another Sweet Home game, but they could do something original, and that's kind of how Resident Evil got started. It's a pretty cool story, and we're going to get more into it in just a second. Sorry, but one more diatribe here really quick. So when Alex talks about the different franchises that Capcom was putting out, obviously Mega Man, Street Fighter, he also brings up another one, which was Breath of Fire. And he talks about how that one was kind of seen as like the first RPG, even though Sweet Home had been an RPG. So while we're talking about the RPGs and we get into Sweet Home kind of being their first RPG, and then Breath of Fire being the one that they kind of consider to be their next sort of big first RPG, they leave out Destiny of an Emperor, which was another role-playing game that was put out in between Sweet Home and Breath of Fire. It's a bit of a one-off. They never really followed up on it, and it's kind of strange to think that it was just pretty much abandoned as a franchise in general. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. It would have treaded on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms stuff, which was really kind of sewn up by Koei at the time. Anyway, we'll forget about that stuff, even though those games are a lot of fun, and we'll get back to focusing on Resident Evil, since that's the focus of Alex's book. I just wanted to take a little side tour really quick to talk about that, because Alex brings it up and I wanted to mention it. Getting back on track, though, we kind of go more into the horror genre and that sort of thing. I disagree with Alex a little bit on this. I don't think Resident Evil started the horror genre. I don't even think they started the survival horror genre. I think they definitely elevated it and brought it into the mainstream, but I don't see them as actually having started the actual genre. It definitely also coined the phrase survival horror, because they weren't called that before Resident Evil came about. it is an incredibly important game in the survival horror genre and in the horror genre in general, but I don't think that it started it. It just, at least in my mind, that's the way it is. You can disagree with that, it's perfectly fine. That's what the comment section is for. There are a few weird things that Alex says that I can just chalk up to the fact that no one else is probably going to care about this except for me. He mentioned that Mystery House was on the Atari 2600. There might have been a game called Mystery House on the 2600. I think the one he's talking about is Haunted House, which is a very different game from the only Mystery House that I know. The Mystery House that I know was a text adventure, not text adventure, but a like a graphical adventure by Sierra. That's the Mystery House that I'm aware of. Haunted House is a very different game, and it's I love the game, but it's very different from what Mystery House is. Now, I would definitely agree that Resident Evil, and at least in my opinion, Resident Evil 2, definitely showed companies how to market horror games. They were not really marketed well before. Most of them were going to be on the PC anyway, and if it wasn't like a fast action game, if it wasn't something like Doom, it probably wasn't going to get marketed very well. Capcom showed people, like, this is the way you present a survival horror when you're trying to actually market it to people, and if you want people to buy your game, this is how it should be done. The story of Resident Evil 1 was pretty interesting to read about. It's something that I had heard before, just the development kind of like the development troubles, like what they had to go through to do this. The different ways that they handled things, like with the live action intro, with a lot of the voice actors, that sort of thing. I had heard that story a few times already, so while I enjoyed reading it, it wasn't as interesting as the development of Resident Evil 2 and 3. I thought those stories were much more interesting than reading about the development of the first game again. Alex starts off with talking about Resident Evil 1.5, which makes a lot of sense because you have to talk about the prototype of Resident Evil 2 before you can really get into how the actual game of Resident Evil 2 came together. 1.5 got abandoned and was eventually found and then released as it was released on the internet and everything like that. So you can see what 1.5 looked like. And you can also find the quotes of the developers who were like, yeah, the game was a piece of shit. It's kind of funny to hear somebody describe a game that they were working on like that, but, I'll take the guy's word for it. Next, Alex gets into a bunch of the other games that were worked on around the same time as what would become Resident Evil 4. And these were a lot of stories that I didn't know at the time, or I didn't know while I was reading this. So it was really cool to read those, especially when it got to what Alex calls Resident Evil 1.9, which turned into Resident Evil 3. And it made a lot of sense that that was originally developed as a side story, because it just kind of feels a little bit different. Just the way that the game plays, it feels a lot like, I've compared it to Clock Tower before, but it just doesn't feel like an actual sequel. It's still a really great game, though. So what's really cool about this is hearing about all of the prototype games, hearing what they turned into, kind of what their original ideas were and how those changed, and in some cases the ones that were abandoned. It's kind of cool to hear these different things, how Resident Evil 1.5 got abandoned, how 1.9 turned into Resident Evil 3, how the original Resident Evil 4 turned into Devil May Cry and then they had to start over. they had the hallucination trailer with a different version of Resident Evil 4. That got scrapped, and then finally we got the Resident Evil 4 that we have now. It's pretty cool to hear about all those different things, and it's one of the things that makes Alex's book just really stand out and definitely much more enjoyable than some of the other books that I've read. We also hear about some of the spin-offs, which I don't really care that much about them. Some of them seem kind of interesting, or at least they have interesting ideas, but it's one of those things where I'm like, I would much rather hear more about, like, the mainline series. As interesting as, like, an MMO Resident Evil game would be, and I'm sure it was for some people, I just don't care about it as much as, hearing about Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 4, that sort of thing. It would have been better if he honestly had kept going and did 5, 6, and 7 instead of covering some of the spin-offs in here, but that's just me nitpicking the book. So I mentioned the different versions of Resident Evil 4, and that takes up a decent chunk of the book, as it probably should. You hear about just the very troubled development of Resident Evil 4, and what it eventually turned into being, and how it kind of changed directions for the Resident Evil franchise. It's cool to read about those things, and how really Resident Evil was always trying to advance itself in different ways. Whether it was with the pre-rendered backgrounds in 1, 2, and 3, then moving into kind of like a more high-resolution pre-rendered background in Code Veronica, and just how they kept trying to move forward, and then eventually going into like a full 3D render with 4. It's just really fun to read about that stuff and see how the series constantly was changing, and it kind of did certain things to either move it in more of a horror direction or more of an action direction. It's fun to just kind of see how all of these things played out, and Alex does a great job of explaining that stuff. So there were a few things that kind of surprised me a little bit, mostly because I had either forgotten about them or just wasn't paying enough attention at the time. I didn't realize how many exclusive titles in the Resident Evil series were on the GameCube, or GameCube exclusive, sorry. Especially with Resident Evil 4, I wasn't really aware that it was a GameCube exclusive at the time, especially since I've got the PS2 version here, and I just wasn't that big into the GameCube back then. It's cool to think about that Capcom really tried to push the GameCube in that way. They released a bunch of exclusive titles for the GameCube, and it's just kind of neat to see them try to do that for Nintendo, and Nintendo had done quite a bit to kind of push the third-party developers away with the N64, and kind of seeing people come back to it is kind of cool. Alex does a little bit of speculation here, where he talks about how poor sales of the GameCube led to poor sales of Resident Evil, causing Capcom to basically port a lot of their stuff over to the PS2. I might have read that a little bit wrong, but that's kind of what I got from reading those sections of the book. I would argue that the GameCube wasn't a failure. It sold a decent number. It didn't sell up to 100 million, and I don't think it broke 50 million. But it sold a decent number. It's a Nintendo console. They're not necessarily seen as like the mature gaming platform. They're kind of seen as like the casual and the party console. So yeah, companies kind of ran a risk of putting out a mature title on it that probably wasn't going to sell as well as if they put it on the PS2. It's weird because Alex makes a lot of really good points. I don't agree with all of them, but I agree with kind of like the core premise of his argument, if that makes any sense. It it would be correct in saying that Resident Evil sold less on the GameCube because of kind of the more family-friendly nature of Nintendo. I don't necessarily think it's because the GameCube was a failure by any stretch of the means. And, like I said, that was just my reading of the book. If you read this, you could come away with a different conclusion. I can definitely see that. I will also say this, like I mentioned earlier, I really felt like they were milking the franchise, especially at this point, because a lot of these just seemed like they were cash grabs for Capcom. And that's not going to last very long. People kind of catch on to the fact that, oh, you're just putting out a new Resident Evil because, you put one out last year in 2004, now it's 2005, so you need to throw out another one for no reason. And people are going to eventually pick up on that. If they don't want to buy your game because they're still playing the one that you put out last year, they're not going to buy your damn game, and that's just kind of the way it is. I will say this, throughout the book, it feels like the team behind Resident Evil was kind of a revolving door. At least, like, the core, the mainline franchise, basically. It seemed like there were always people coming and going, and Alex does a good job of explaining that. It led to some pretty cool ideas in the Resident Evil series. It's just, I'm not sure how you can get a lot of continuity out of it. It feels a little weird to me, but that's game development. It's something that I never worked in, but I've read a lot about, and it feels like that just happens all the time. So I just want to say this was a great book. I really enjoy reading about the history of video game franchises, and this does a really great job of doing that, just explaining most of the history of the Resident Evil series. I would have loved to have seen Alex get in Resident Evil 5, 6, and 7, but I understand why he didn't, because that didn't have the original team, so yeah, he had to cut it off at some point, I guess. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody.